Hey everybody, it's Party Elite, continuing my mini-series about potential DLC for Total War Warhammer 2. Skipping over some of the Regiments of Renown and faction-specific content for now, I want to talk about another faction that I think we're very likely to see. Now, first things first, how is the name pronounced? Araby is certainly the English pronunciation, but considering I try to get the French accent in for everything from Bretonia, I'm going to do the same for these guys and assume the actual pronunciation is Araby. My only experience with Arabic being 3 years I lived in the real-world geographical equivalent of Araby, and with that said, let's start. Yalla Habibi. So what can we expect from Araby? What is their history, who do they bring to the table, and what might they bring to the field? A lot of the information in this video is based off of a project that I've linked to in the description down below, so be sure to check out the website and the associated book. Also, with so much to cover, I do have timestamps in the description down below as well. Araby is located just west of the Land of the Dead, separated from the Tomb Kings by the Great Desert of Araby. Religious zealots, traders, merchants, sailors, warriors, and pirates, the people of Araby are a collection of various ethnic groups that can be seen as far up as in Marienburg and Ehrengrad, and their ships can often be found moored at the docks of Lothern, as the elves and Araby have traded for centuries. North of the River of the Serpent is where the most densely populated parts of the nation rest. The four great cities of Lashik, the city of corsairs, Kofr, the spice port, Martek, and Al-Haik, the city of thieves. There are lesser cities elsewhere as well, El Kalabad to the south and Kasabar to the west. Bel Aliad was once a major city but now lies in ruin. These cities, all of them, are ruled as independent states by caliphs, sultans, sheikhs, and emirs, with the great sultan, owner of all the land of Araby, seated at Al-Haik as a descendant of the great prophet's bloodline. Despite the claims that Araby is a unified nation working in harmony, the truth is that the lesser powers, caliphs, sultans, sheikhs, and emirs, are constantly bickering and warring with each other in the hopes of asserting their own dominance in the region, though they all recognize the authority of the great sultan. While the cities and their inhabitants reside with permanence along the coast, one cannot forget the nomadic tribes that inhabit the deserts of the nation. A rougher breed of people riding about on horse and camelback, traveling the desert potentially from oasis to oasis. The nomads are certainly a more brutish people, but they still have social structure and laws of their own. Nomadic tribes migrate to oases in the summer months, potentially traveling to nearby cities for trade, but as autumn sets in, the tribes begin to move from place to place, with spring being the best season for their lifestyle, returning to a spring or well when the arid summer months return. Tribes have their own territory, and though the boundaries are unofficial, tribes have been known to form alliances with neighboring tribes, and likewise, some tribes don't get along, and conflict can break out at any moment. The nomads of Araby are raiders and respect the bravery of raiding. This goes for men and women, traveling great distances on camelback to conduct raids that bring wealth back to the tribe. The tribes of Araby will likely make an appearance in the game, potentially as horde factions. I don't imagine we'll see all of them, as some are fairly small, but the tribes include the Honorable Ghutani, the Turjuk horsemasters, the merchants and thinkers of Mutzil, the uncivilized raiders of the Tuareg, the wealthy Assad tribe, the religious Bakr, the herders and entrepreneurs of Taif, the warriors of Dhib, the Nasr who watch over the desert mosque, the frantic raiders of Malaluk, the Ebonian raiders, the Zamesi who are currently at odds with the Sultan of Kasabar, and perhaps most importantly, the Kayed, who are most loyal to the Sultan and also most numerous. Apart from a tribal system, I imagine there will be some better implementation of trade, as trade is essential to the nation, and through it, Araby has become extremely wealthy and is also able to obtain goods that are otherwise unavailable in the more desolate part of the world. Trade has, in fact, made Araby wealthier than the dwarfs, a people that literally spend their lives mining valuable goods out of the earth. Slavery is equally important, though quite fascinating in Araby. One can become a slave as a result of debt, breaking the law, or simply being uncivilized as dictated by their faith, and in the first two cases, emancipation can result from various factors, and slavery is not hereditary. In the case of the third, there is no way to simply be enlightened and released from your chains, and it can be hereditary unless enlightenment is attained beforehand. Slaves are essential in performing a lot of the manual labor around Araby, maintaining fields and roads and structures, for example, but the most elite military forces in Araby, the Mamelukes, are also just slaves of the great Sultan, captured at a young age by other Mamelukes trained to become the very best and most loyal of warriors. With this importance of slaves, there are laws that come with slavery as well, laws that ensure a slave owner is responsible for their slave and their slave's action or their well-being, and there are rules that prevent slave owners from freeing a slave simply because they've become a burden. This is no Dark Elf-style slavery, though a life of a slave is never ideal, of course. Finally, religion is extremely important to Araby. A monotheistic people, they worship Al-Nan or Ormazd and were led to enlightenment by the first prophet Mulhaid al-Qayyat. Religion unified Araby, and its symbology and dogmas are plentiful and important. It makes me wonder if we're likely to see the introduction of a religion mechanic in the game, acting similar to corruption with regards to its effects on public order. So that's what Araby is today, but how did this nation come to be? Well, the people of Araby have lived in this region since the dawn of human civilization and were originally all a nomadic people, proud with a sense of honor and loyalty, naturally resulting in a history of war. When the elves arrived, bonding with the Arabians over a mutual love of horses, a few trading posts were built that eventually became the cities of Al-Haik, Dashik, and Kofr. These trading posts brought in many nomads from the desert, and the nomadic people slowly started settling down. Within 100 years, Arabians settled along the coast and began to spread westward to form a border with Khemri and the Tomb Kings. This eventually led to the Wars of Death. Arkan the Black led forces that quickly devastated the western reaches of Araby, turning cities like Bel Aliad to ruins in an instant. Araby was able to hold the tide back, but over 1,000 years, Arkan the Black's forces raided Araby constantly, whittling down its strength and will. Able to survive in the uninhabitable desert, Arkan's forces would wait in the desert, strike cities, and then retreat into the desert to reorganize, reinforce, and strike once more. This constant war resulted in the eventual fracturing of Araby into disparate city-states fending for themselves in the constant onslaught. Internal strife picked up as well, further weakening Araby as a whole, and then, suddenly, one day, Arkan and his forces were gone. The people of Araby had no idea what may have happened, but after 1,000 years of constant wars with a foreign threat, a time of relative peace came about. War between the different nations of Araby continued, but this did not compare to the undead onslaught, and as a result, Araby prospered over the following centuries. As this time of prosperity continued, one Arabian prince, Abdul bin Rashid, decided to go exploring the ruins of Nehekhara. 8 years he spent traveling the length and breadth of Nehekhara and wrote all that he saw and learned into a tome that later would come to be known as the Book of the Dead. On returning home with this knowledge, the prince eventually died of mysterious circumstances. His servants found him behind his locked doors with a purple face, ice cold to the touch. The Caliph of Kasabur ordered that all copies of the prince's book be destroyed, though some survived in private collections and others still were taken to the Old World by crusaders of the Empire, Telea, and Bretonia. This tome is how the world knows details of Nehekhara and what happened there. Araby was first properly united as a result of religion. A wandering nomad, Mulhaid al-Qayyat, came across the desert mosque in the Atalan Mountains, had a vision, and went to the city of Martek to begin preaching about his experience. At first, he was ignored as a rambling lunatic, but a following began to gather. This following grew, and the prophet traveled from city to city, preaching or conquering as required, until all of Araby was united under him. The great palace of Al-Haik was built, Araby prospered, and the laws of the land were set in the holy book of Ormazd. When Mulhaid al-Qayyat passed away, his son became the next great sultan, and the rest of Araby was split between caliphs and sultans. Over the next 200 years, the people of Araby came to learn with certainty of the existence of lizardmen during an expedition that led Ibn Jalaba to Zlatlan. There was no conflict, but the expedition was turned back. Later still, the Corsair Wars began as the cities on the coast of Araby prospered and flourished, and Corsairs of Araby confidently sailed upon their dhows, plundering the coasts of Telea and Estalia. In response, the Teleans hired Norse warriors and their longships, and in response to that, the Corsairs attacked the Norse stronghold in Sartosa and slaughtered the Norse. After this, the Corsair assaults on Telea became worse, until just under 300 years later, Sartosa was taken back by the Norse. At this point, Araby and the Old World began trade again, though there is the matter of the Crusades. An Arabian sorcerer, Jaffar, united the nomadic tribes of Araby with charisma and the magical ability to summon genies, or jinni, and swept out of the desert to make himself the great Sultan. Unifying Araby with an iron fist, Jaffar was convinced by the Skaven that Estalian kingdoms were planning an invasion. As a preemptive maneuver, Jaffar landed in southern Estalia with a massive army and pushed north, sending Estalians back to Araby and slavery. This invasion pushed into Tilea, but the city-state of Tabaro was able to repel the attack, forcing Araby to pull back. Then, the united forces of Britannia and the counts of the empire marched into Estalia. Largely consisting of heavy cavalry, they overpowered the forces of Araby, and Sultan Jaffar had to retreat. During this retreat, however, Sheikh Emir Wazar, or Emir the Cruel, was left behind to hold Maghrida, while the retreating army set ablaze all the villages in their path. This further enraged the crusading response army, and they split in two, half besieging Maghrida, the other half chasing after Jaffar. This army looked to destroy Araby, a campaign of vengeance. Cities were put to the sword, and as people grew tired of Jaffar's tyranny in Araby as well, Jaffar's plans slowly fell apart until he was finally killed at the Battle of Al-Haik. The Crusades continued for another century or so as the Crusaders chased remaining bandits and warriors, but ultimately, the Crusaders had to return to the Old World, as Araby was far too harsh and vast to be held. As they returned, however, they made sure to loot Araby and destroy what was left of Jaffar's fleet. Later, one Prince Arnold went exploring Araby in the hopes of amassing great wealth as he robbed Kemrian tombs on his way over. Eventually, he assaulted a caravan that broke the truce between the Caliph and the Crusades, and so the Sultan sent an army after the prince, catching his forces on the plain of Haytin, slaughtering them all. Once more, an era of peace came upon Araby, leading to complacency, lethargy, and maybe some decadence. More civil war followed, many cities fell to shambles, and there was dispute over the successor to the throne. There was also an attempt at conquering parts of the border prince's territory. Abdul al-Shar, an ambitious warlord, unhappy with what he had, upset at the Crusades, decided to venture north in the hopes of warring against the empire. As he tried to form a small outpost, he had to contend with greenskins, ultimately failing. He was assassinated by his own people, and his lands fell into disrepair, eventually being completely lost. When the dead rose again, just under a century and a half after the end of the Crusades, the deserts of Araby were once more swarming with undead legions. Nagash was back, and the Caliph of Kasabur took the title of Grand Caliph as he united Araby in a war against the undead. Alongside the dwarfs, they were able to hold the undead but could not defeat them. This was until the sorcerers of Araby turned to the elves for help, learned the lore of light, returned to Araby, and finally set the forces of the undead back. A handful of centuries later, the Gorhunt tribe from Norska, worshippers of corn, came to Araby seeking skulls for the Skull Throne. Though they were only a fraction of the size of the Araby army, they fought like Chaos Warriors are known to and slaughtered any opposition sent to fight them until finally the emirs of Araby sent giant beasts of war alongside their armies into battle against the Norscan invaders. The final great struggle that Araby faced before we arrive at present day was the Carian children, Matmasi. One of the first vampires of Lamia, Matmesis, led a very subversive campaign against Araby, preying on small villages and caravans and sneaking into small cities that they would turn over time. This began to tear away at the fabric of Araby, and people began to live in constant fear and disorder. Eventually, only the 4 great cities of the northern coast remained, and the great Sultan, out of desperation, sent emissaries across Araby asking for assistance. Tribesmen responded to the call, as did Tilayan mercenaries, followed by the Arabian city-states and their grand armies. The two sides fought bitterly until the great battle near Vulture Mountain, where Caliph Abdul el-Rashad slew Matmesis and the undead crumbled, turning to dust. Though Araby survived as a nation, it was devastated in every way imaginable. The war had been expensive, crushing the economy and reducing her strength tremendously. It would take a very long time for Araby to return to its former greatness. Now, that was a fairly long history lesson, but I feel that it certainly ties into the gameplay mechanics, factions, and possible quests that we'll be seeing out of Araby. Something quite fascinating about Araby is how magic works in the region. Far from either pole, the winds of magic blow very weakly over Araby, making it a lot harder to cast magic in a traditional way, as we've seen with the other factions. Instead, sorcerers of Araby use their powers to control the elemental spirits of the desert, the jinni or genies, who in turn provide magical support. This is how, for example, flying carpets work. When an air elemental is bound to a carpet, allowing the carpet itself to fly, swoop around, and be an excellent wingman when necessary.
It's lovely.
It would be really interesting to see this manifested in the game. Just like dwarfs use runic magic, perhaps the sorcerers of Araby will have to select jinn to bring to the battlefield, changing the brand of magic available to them. It's possible that their magic won't be tied to the winds of magic, but instead these elementals. Or perhaps beyond that, the sorcerers will need to summon these jinn and only be able to use them as casters for as long as they remain on the battlefield, slowly withering away like other summoned units. Keep this in mind anytime I mention the lores that any caster has access to. We might see a very unique execution. This unique method of casting has also resulted in the lore of the desert, or the lore of sand, a unique lore of magic with potential for some interesting spells. With the lore attribute Shifting Sands, we might see enemy speeds and charge bonuses greatly reduced when a spell is being cast. Spells like Curse of the Genie or Curse of the Jinn might act as direct damage spells, while something like Mirage can be used like the Net of a Mintok, freezing units in place as they are under its influence. Dancing Scimitar and Sunstrike would make two magic missiles, though I'd imagine Sunstrike to be a bombardment spell instead to add some variety to the lore, while Quicksand will either be a direct damage spell or a speed debuffing hex like Gork'll Fix-It. Finally, Sandstorm will likely be a vortex spell, potentially targeting airborne units as well as ground units. With that said and done, on to the factions and the legendary lords. As per the rich history of Araby, the Great Sultan would be in charge of the main faction of Araby as the faction leader. There have been quite a few named characters in the history lesson, but none of them were in the right timeline to be the current Great Sultan. There is a character in the resource I mentioned at the start of this video, and though he isn't the Great Sultan, I feel like with a name like Salahuddin, Creative Assembly might opt to use him, at least as a reference to build the Great Sultan. Now, remember, the Great Sultan is a direct descendant of the Great Prophet, so we can probably expect some magical armor and magical weapons, maybe an aura that inspires greater leadership, or perhaps some items or an ability that grant the Unbreakable trait to a unit or units within an area when used. I imagine the Great Sultan to be a support role character, high melee damage perhaps, but middling melee attack and melee defense stats, perhaps with some damage resistance to keep him safe in combat as he relies more on area of effect abilities that grant things like Frenzy, immunity to psychology, and the aforementioned items that might grant the Unbreakable trait. Possibly even an ability similar to Mist of the Lady that emboldens his allies and hurts enemies when the Great Sultan is engaged in battle. I'm torn between two default states of the Great Sultan as far as mounts go. On the one hand, I think they'd march into battle just fine. On the other, I'd like the default to be a palanquin, much like Thorgrim Grudgebearer being carried on the field by a handful of slaves. Naturally, the Great Sultan will also have a horse as an option, potentially a camel, and almost definitely a war elephant, at which point melee combat would become less of an issue. On the campaign map, I imagine the Great Sultan would first need to unite Araby under his banner with his starting position at Al-Haik, and then potentially destroy the Tomb Kings, followed by conquering the rest of the Southlands and Sartosa. This would eventually put him in conflict with the Crusaders as well. It is possible that this aggression could spread to Lustria, but I can't see the age-old alliance between High Elves and Araby fall under the Great Sultan as a part of the faction's objectives, so we probably won't be hitting Ulthuan. Sultan Jaffar will likely be another legendary lord, though he died about 1,000 years before the current events of the game. I feel it likely that Sultan Jaffar is brought back to life through some dark magic, or he might have descendants who wish to return his rather unpopular glory. Whatever form he shows up in, if he does, he will be a caster lord, bringing the lore of shadow and the lore of death. Not really meant to be in melee, he would likely fall apart quickly if engaged, but I imagine friendly units nearby him would receive a frenzy trait or perhaps become unbreakable for fear of being punished for leaving the field. I think that Sultan Jaffar causes fear, perhaps even terror, as his conquests and methods are well known. I think he is likely to come in on foot, on horseback, on camelback, or potentially on a magic carpet, and he may come in with additional items and abilities that cause direct damage to enemy units or potentially entangle them in metaphorical nets. The Serpent Staff, which I believe will be a quest item, would be an interesting magical item that acts like the Prey of Anathema. Pin an enemy unit in place to prevent a charge, and maybe instead of reduced missile resistance, it'll prevent the enemy from attacking. On the campaign map, I'd like to see Sultan Jaffar start in the Great Desert or even the Shifting Sands. Uninhabitable places, yes, but perhaps the only place a man like Jaffar and his kin could escape to. I imagine Jaffar's first task would be to unite all the nomadic tribes of Araby under his iron fist, and then move to slaughter all the crusaders in Araby. His past would give him direct ties and even hatred for these people, and vengeance seems fitting. After that, he'd likely look to unite Araby under his own banner, and I can see Jaffar wanting something to do with the Great Vortex. He seems quite curious about the dark arts, and I imagine he'd want to disrupt the Great Vortex, or at least go hunting for knowledge about it. This would likely put him in direct conflict with the Lizardmen and probably the High Elves as well. Next up, I believe we'll get the Golden Magus. This sorcerer of the south, the Golden Magus, will be a caster lord, also capable in melee. While he makes himself appear as a wise man with exotic tastes, dressed in fine silks and dusted with powdered gold, he truly is lethal in combat, moving quickly and killing foes with his flaming sword, the Sword of Fiery Curses, which I believe will be a quest item. Calling himself the Sultan of the Seas, he is claimed to be a merchant prince, an exile of the College of Mages, and even the Gilded King of Kofr reborn. In the resource I've linked to, it's suggested that he might come with the lores of fire, metal, heavens, light, and the lore of the desert or sand. It's quite possible that he comes in with all of these lores available to him, similar to somebody like Mazda Mundi, or perhaps you have to capture or pick an elemental to carry into battle or on the campaign map to affect what magic is available. His magical nature may also be reflected in damage resistance through his Golden Robes of Protection quest item, and perhaps some area of effect abilities that strengthen the resolve of allies or damage enemy units. As mounts, I imagine he'll either come in on foot, on horseback, on camelback, or on a magic carpet. Most interesting about the self-styled Sultan of the Seas, however, are his magical jars and urns, the former of which can conjure elemental spirits hundreds of feet tall, while the latter can supposedly bring worse to bear. Much like Krell works, I imagine the magical jars can be used to bring these genies or jinn to the field as additional units. There are supposedly two, one of fire and one of air. I suspect they will both be ethereal, cause magical damage as well as fire damage where applicable, and will probably cause fear and terror while also having frenzy. They might also be able to cast spells of their own, the lore of fire and the lore of heavens, increasing the magical capabilities on the field. The urns, if even in-game, will likely be used to bring in a higher tier of jinn, one that lasts longer on the field, does more damage, and is much harder to bring down. I wouldn't be entirely surprised if the Golden Magus starts in an entirely different part of the world. Maybe gone adventuring for treasures or new knowledge. We might find him in Lustria, battling lizardmen for control of great temple cities, or he might even proceed to battle the undead legions of the Vampire Coast, feeling right at home, and potentially look to remove the Dark Elves from the world, as they too would be considered evil. A long shot, I know, but it'd be more interesting than having him start just a few turns south of Al-Haik. Alternatively, it's possible that as the Sultan of the Seas, he'll want to go around conquering and caring only for coastal cities across the map, though that would put him at odds quite heavily with Ulthuan. Finally, Jasmine Silverveil is a character that exists in the resource that I have linked below, and while I'm okay with things being a little on the nose, this might be a little too on the nose for me. Nonetheless, she's written about as the only child of the current Great Sultan, which makes her the only character written about that is closest to being the faction leader. And while it'd be interesting to have a Princess of Araby be the faction leader, I just hope her name isn't Jasmine. I don't think I'd be able to take her seriously, and I'd question why there was no Prince Ali Ababwa. With a horse from Ulthuan named Snowmane, Jasmine has one of the fastest horses in all of Araby, and her father taught her in preparation to be the Great Sultan. A great melee combatant and also a magic caster, I imagine she'll be along the lines of the Fae Enchantress as far as her abilities go if she's in the game. Able to use spells from the lore of light or the lore of heavens, she'd only be able to come in on foot or on Snowmane, and the Sword of Light will likely be a quest item that grants her higher melee attack and damage as well as magical damage, while the Anklet of Ormazd will likely be a quest item that gives her damage resistance. It's possible that many aspects I discussed of the Great Sultan would make a show here too, driving nearby units to battle with more ferocity, potentially hurting enemy units nearby, and maybe bringing an immunity to psychology to those nearby. After all, she's a descendant of the Prophet. If she's the faction leader, she will start in Al-Haik with the objectives I discussed of the Great Sultan. If she's just a legendary lord, however, I'd like to see her start somewhere in the Great Desert, or even in Nagaroth, though the latter is extremely unlikely. Starting in the Great Desert, she would look to unite the nomadic tribes, competing with Jaffar, and then turn to either conquer the rest of Araby, one way or another. Her next objective might drive her to Nagaroth at that point, considering her ties to the High Elves through Snowmane. In all honesty, I'm a little concerned and uncertain about how they'll get 4 legendary lords in for Araby. They occupy a very small space and are right next to the Tomb Kings. It'll be interesting to see how it's approached, and I'm hoping for some far-reaching approaches like what I've mentioned just moments ago, starting points in Lustria and maybe even Nagaroth. I know for sure I'd definitely like to see the tribal aspects come into play with nomadic tribes marching around the deserts looking for war or respite. It'd be nice to see one of these nomadic tribes as a horde faction option out of Araby as well. After all, they have a culture of raiding. I'd also like to see, as I mentioned earlier, a form of corruption where the religion of Araby needs to be spread alongside the conquests to keep public order from faltering. Using priests or imams to spread religion would be interesting as well, especially if resulting rebellions in foreign lands are the nomadic Arabian tribes. I'd also like to see a slavery mechanic implemented here and hopefully more attention to trade and special resources. After all, these things are crucial to Araby. Generic lords will likely be sultans coming in as melee warriors on foot, on palanquins, or on horseback. They might also have access to war elephants, and I expect they'll have similar abilities to the Great Sultan, though with smaller auras or reduced strength. A Grand Vizier is also likely as a candidate for Caster Lord, coming in on foot, on horseback, or on flying carpets. These casters will likely come in a few variants, providing the lores of fire, metal, heavens, and light, and potentially the lore of the desert or sand. If nomadic factions exist, the Sultan will likely be replaced by sheikhs who can come in on foot or on camelback. I think the heroes and agents will come in a few forms as well. We'll get melee characters as caliphs, and if a nomadic faction exists, they'll likely have emirs to fill that same role. Apart from coming in on foot, they'll likely also have horses as mounts in the case of caliphs, and camels in the case of emirs. Casters will come in the form of viziers, with access to the lores of fire, metal, heavens, and light, and potentially that lore of the desert. I would also be interested in seeing Hashashin based on their real-world counterpart as assassin characters on the battlefield. Able to stalk and sneak around the field, vanguard, deploy, stay hidden, get close, and do a great deal of damage in melee or perhaps even from range with a hand crossbow. I suspect they'll also have abilities or items that allow the Hashashin to become unbreakable, immune to psychology, or frenzied. It is possible, however, that these guys come in as a unit instead, a small unit with just a handful of soldiers able to cause a great deal of anti-infantry damage. These guys would likely be on the higher tier of things if that is the case. On that note though, let's start talking about potential units. Slaves will likely be the peasant mob equivalent of Araby. Cheap, inefficient in combat, but a great method of making barriers. I imagine they'll count as expendable, and they might actually be half-decently equipped. We spoke earlier of the importance of slaves in Araby, so it's possible that they will at least be handed shields and short swords or short spears to fight, rather than appearing on the field with pitchforks. Warriors will likely be the baseline unit. A martial people, there are plenty of soldiers in Araby, so I'd like to see large unit sizes for these low-tier infantry units. I imagine a few variants. Sword and shield for one, and they'll probably have curved scimitars and crescent moon shields, followed by spears for anti-large support, and possibly great weapons for armor-piercing damage. Who knows, maybe the warriors of Araby also carry kopeshes into the battlefield as great weapons. I believe all of these guys, including the great weapon variant, will be lightly armored, and we might also see a spears with shields variant in here as well. Next up, we'll likely see the Dibukim, a battle pilgrim equivalent. These are fanatics that drink the blood of their enemies before battle to work themselves into a ferocious mindset. With higher melee attack stats but low melee defense stats, I see these guys to be somewhat armored and coming in with sword and shield. I imagine they'll have frenzy and everything that results from it, with immunity to psychology representing their devotion. They might even be unbreakable, so a blend between battle pilgrims and flagellants. Corsairs are another infantry unit I think we'll likely see on the battlefield. Pirates from Lashik, these Corsairs are known for their heroic antics and swashbuckling, though there are no heroes. I suspect they'll be unarmored melee combatants coming in with swords, possibly with vanguard deployment and extremely high speeds to be used as pseudo-cavalry. It's possible they'll be able to stalk to sneak up on unsuspecting enemy units, lending these guys to be a great support role as flankers and rear chargers that cause a great deal of morale damage but can't stick around in melee for too long. Janissaries are the next tier of infantry as direct property of the Great Sultan. Coming in with swords and shields or halberds, I see Janissaries as potentially anti-infantry and anti-large specialists with higher than usual leadership and potentially an immunity to psychology, though I'm a little doubtful on that front. At the highest tier of infantry, we'll likely see the Palace Guard. These are the most loyal troops in all of Araby, trained through the most rigorous of methods. These soldiers are the types to kill themselves if their Sultan told them to, loyal not only to the Sultan, but the religious order as well. I suspect we're going to get Palace Guard with swords and shields, and Palace Guard with halberds, resulting in very strong anti-infantry and anti-large capabilities. I suspect, however, that they'll have middling melee attack but high melee defense to reflect their role, and they might actually have the Guardian trait as well. Despite their status, I imagine they'll be relatively lightly armored, more so than other Araby infantry, but nowhere near the armor of dwarfs or warriors of chaos, maybe not even coming close to the Empire greatswords. It would be interesting to see these guys as small groups of elite units with the Unbreakable trait, forcing them to fight to the death for their nation and God. Dervishes will likely make it to the field as well. From the archaic warrior tribe, these soldiers are known as an unstoppable force on the battlefield, warriors with exceptional skill. Carrying two scimitars ruthlessly into battle, I suspect high melee attack and defense stats and the ability to deflect arrows like slayers do. Medium levels of armor but extremely high leadership coupled with frenzy will make for a unit that deals a great deal of damage, and once more, we might see the anti-infantry trait come into play. I suspect they'll be extremely fast and might even have vanguard deployment available to them. Blade Dancers are the bastard daughters taken from the Sultan's harem, taught to be warriors from an early age. Those that survive training become the Blade Dancers, or the Dread Daughters of Tariq, named after the Sultan Tariq. Terribly armored but extremely fast on the battlefield, I see the Blade Dancers as another pseudo-cavalry unit, able to push in from various angles and cause a great deal of hurt with high melee attack and defense stats. With their training, I suspect extremely high leadership as well, if not the Unbreakable trait, or at least frenzy to reflect their abilities with the blade. When it comes to ranged support, I believe we'll see a few variants of bowmen as the base unit. Terrible in melee, but likely coming in regular, fire, and poison variants, these guys will be your typical archer unit on the field. Then, we'll get the nomad hunters. Using armor-piercing jazales, these guys will fire their guns into enemy lines and hope to cause a significant amount of damage before lines meet. Possibly with vanguard and stalk, the hunters were guerrilla soldiers who took up arms against the foreign invaders during the Crusades, and their sneaky approach will likely translate into the game with this vanguard deployment and stalking capability. The more interesting ranged unit will be the Nafatun, naphtha throwers tossing clay or ceramic pots that explode on impact and spread fire among enemy ranks. These guys will likely be causing armor-piercing and fire damage, and I imagine their damage will have the burnt trait, causing extra leadership damage. Lightly armored and pathetic in melee, they will need to be kept safe until their little ammunition runs out. Desert Riders will likely come in a few variants, providing cavalry support on the field. On horseback, we will likely see a very fast set of cavalry units, one standard light cavalry unit, one built for anti-infantry use with barding, and finally a ranged variant. As Araby's history goes, the Desert Riders probably stand little chance against enemy cavalry, and I doubt Araby would have much large anti-large support, at least in the form of cavalry. These guys will be poorly armored, but have great charge bonuses and melee attack with low melee defense. That's my guess at least. The ranged variant will likely be able to fire while moving, and I should hope they'll be able to fire in any direction while moving as well. Camel Riders will likely be more expensive, a little slower but perhaps more durable. They might cause fear, which is funny to think in a world of the undead and dragons, but camels do look pretty messed up, I guess. I suspect we'll see these guys be tireless, having full vigor throughout a battle, which might actually be a trait that an Arabian army has for many of its units, making them tireless in battle. We will also probably get very nice anti-infantry stats from these Camel Riders. They might have some degree of anti-large capabilities to represent that horses are afraid of them, but I don't think that's likely, After all, anti-large applies to things like Carnosaurs too, and I doubt a Carnosaur is afraid of a camel. Decent in melee but with poor melee defense and low armor, I suspect the camel riders will be great for hit-and-run tactics to support the infantry main line. It would be very cool to see Nafatun on camelback, having them ride by, throwing ceramic pots, setting the enemy alight, and retreating to safety, but that's fairly unlikely, I think. Mamelukes will likely be the highest tier of cavalry. Once more direct property of the Sultan, these are slaves from remote places that are trained from an early age to charge into battle and cause devastating amounts of damage. Very expensive, I imagine, and with decent melee attack stats, low melee defense stats, but the only Araby cavalry with decent armor. These guys will have more sticking power in melee combat. We might see a variant with halberds to provide large anti-large capabilities, but I think it more likely that these guys will have anti-infantry and an extremely high charge bonus as they thunder down the field to slaughter the Sultan's enemies. Flying carpet riders transition us from the mundane into the magical. Apart from the casters and lords who ride flying carpets into the field, I suspect we'll also see flying carpet riders fly in with bow and arrow, firing regular, fiery, or poisonous arrows into the enemy. Terrible in melee with just tiny daggers, I imagine these guys will fly around the battlefield looking for a chance to drop their explosive ceramic pots to the ground in what can only be called carpet bombing, much like gyrocopters. We might in fact see a bomber variant that carries more bombs but doesn't have any other ranged capabilities. I suspect these guys will be very fast as well, but extremely poorly armored and with very little health as well. In other words, they're not very rugged. In fact, they're probably easy to unravel. In the air alongside the flying carpets, we're likely to see the Rook. These are based on real-world mythology, giant birds that live in the mountain ranges and rocky islands of Araby in the fantasy world, supposedly able to carry off elephants. The Rook will likely come as lone birds in a unit, cause fear and terror, and do a devastating amount of damage in melee. I imagine they'll have a scaly skin equivalent, or at least be heavily armored. Living among mountains, you probably develop a thick skin under the feathers. Back on the ground, we're likely to see war elephants with Howdah carrying a crew with, in my mind, ranged capabilities or anti-large capabilities, depending on the variant taken to the field. The ranged version probably does anti-infantry damage by virtue of being a giant elephant on the field, while the anti-large variant probably has tusks covered in blades and armor and carries spearmen to poke away at enemy beasts and cavalry. I suspect a lumbering unit here with middling melee stats made up for by large, sweeping animations spreading a great deal of armor-piercing damage across the board. I doubt we'll see a feral variant, though it'd be nice to see a middling leadership that can easily turn into rampaging elephants. Moving on, I think we'll see Jinni, independent of masters, on the field as monstrous infantry. Ethereal with access to the lore of heavens, these guys will be frightening or terrifying with immunity to psychology and a strider trait to represent the fact that they hover around. Very high magical damage melee attack stats, but low melee defense stats supported by their ethereal damage resistance. I imagine they'll cause a great deal of hurt in melee as well. We might also see wishes appear on the battlefield as battlefield abilities that can be used once per battle. Maybe using a wish costs the Jinn some hit points, but we will likely see wishes that inspire units within a range, increase damage resistance for a unit, or maybe make a unit unbreakable. Unfortunately, as we know, they are incapable of killing people, bringing people back from the dead, or making people fall in love. We might also see the lesser-known fiery variant, the Irfit, as another type of Jinn. These will be similar in all ways, except the Irfit will have access to the lore of fire and cause fire damage instead of magical damage, I think. Finally, we are likely to see artillery from Araby as well. I wouldn't be surprised if there are massive great cannons as individual units that are extremely expensive, very low on ammunition, but cause a great deal of damage. We might also get smaller cannons akin to the Empire Great Cannons, providing some anti-large range support for the troops. Araby would be an interesting addition to Total War Warhammer 2. A very different army in both look and feel. I'd love to see these guys brought to life, if only to give us something unique to play with. You know, amidst the dragons and the man-sized rats and dinosaurs riding dinosaurs. Now, hopefully we're not wrong in our prediction and we're going to see this grand army of camels and carpets soon. With that, I'd like to thank you as always for watching, and if you'd like more Total War content, make sure you subscribe to this channel for an endless flow of battles, let's plays, news, and constant speculation.